The Big Five personality model is, to date, the most widely accepted classification system for the abstract nature of personality. But even among the model, one trait easily stands out among the rest: openness to experience. This dimension is meant to be an all-encompassing metric for creativity. But because creativity is so complex and such an abstract metric to try and quantify, the research on creativity is, well, a bit all over the place. And so originally my plan was to make a full breakdown on creativity, what it is, the biology behind it, and whether or not it can be improved. But this is a very daunting task, and as of scripting this video, over 1,100 papers exist on just what creativity is alone. So instead, think of this video as an intro into what creativity is, exploring it from multiple different angles and perspectives. But first, I want you to picture something. After a single hearing, a 14-year-old Mozart perfectly transcribed a 12-minute song from 9 voices into one piece, completely from memory. What would it take someone to do something like this? Is it intelligence? Creativity? Possibly a mix of both? What about someone like Steve Jobs, building Apple from the ground up? He's not very artistic and was probably not as interested in music. Yet, I doubt anyone would suggest he wasn't creative. The problem with trying to quantify creativity is that two people can have very different temperaments, outward appearances, and beliefs, but still both be considered creative. As a result, the different manifestations of what it means to be creative has cultivated a compelling case to split openness to experience into 2 further dimensions: intellect and openness. Intellect is a subdimension that encompasses traits like intelligence, interest in ideas, and verbal fluency, while openness is a subdimension that suggests one excels at artistic and aesthetic domains, and includes things like being poetic, fantasy-prone, or interested in art or fashion. Of course, a lot of overlap exists between these 2 subdimensions, which is why they fit into the broader category of openness to experience. And in general, openness to experience is defined by the key trait of being exploratory, so being open to new ideas, open to new experiences, and open to new perspectives. But before proceeding, we need to get a baseline of who we are referring to when we say you are a creative person. While it's typical to describe an individual as being creative, I think you'd agree when I say that creativity means different things to different people. Some use it to describe an artist, others an exceptional scientist. Based off the description we laid out earlier, both of these people are creative. So it's more accurate to consider openness to experience as a characteristic shared across many people, even if it doesn't manifest in the same way. More than any other trait, openness to experience is defined by the cognitive abilities that set it apart. And because of that, it makes sense that the connection between openness to experience and intelligence is the most studied facet of this trait. For example, in a study by DeYoung and colleagues in 2014, it was found the intellect subdimension of openness to experience is more strongly associated with intelligence, but that the other subdimension, openness, was also a good predictor of a specific facet of intelligence. Specifically, intellect was correlated with many different intelligence types, including general, nonverbal, and verbal intelligence, while openness was only correlated with verbal intelligence. Still, openness to experience was not meant to be a good predictor of intelligence, even though that seems to be the case. Openness was meant to measure creativity. And it's hypothesized that openness to experience is linked to creativity through the neural architecture that underlies both. Both have been demonstrated to correlate with different regions of the brain that are responsible for attention and decision-making, specifically by acting on the lateral prefrontal and anterior inferior parietal regions, as well as on the brain's default mode network, which is made up of the cortical midline, medial temporal, and posterior inferior parietal, and is active when an individual is not focused on the outside world, so when the brain is at rest. Both creative and open people tend to have semantic memory networks with more flexible associations between concepts. As a result, they exhibit more unique thought patterns, and this is what researchers believe translates to thinking and reasoning about the world differently than less creative people. Specifically, creativity has been defined as the ability to mix domains together to make something new. As an example, evolutionary psychology is a discipline created by mixing 2 distinct domains together, psychology and evolutionary biology. This flexible thinking pattern is probably why open people are better at creating new things. But what if I told you that open people not only think about the world differently, but have a different level of sensitivity towards it too? Emerging research has indicated the more open someone is, the more likely they are to exhibit distinct responses to sensory stimuli. As an example, McCrae in 2007 focused his research on aesthetic chills, so the chills you get when listening to music that makes you feel a certain way, or listening to a speech that really resonates with you. And he found that open individuals tend to experience goosebumps and shivers in reaction to art or music more frequently compared to less open people. Another interesting note is that open people are more likely to experience mixed emotional states, including both positive and negative emotions in quick succession, which could be where the tortured artist narrative comes from. It's believed that these emotional swings originate from differences in how sensory information is processed, and is consistent with the idea individuals with high levels of openness tend to have a less restrictive filter for processing subconscious information. The other thing is that the more open someone is, the less likely they are to disregard things previously thought to be unimportant, broadening the scope of stimuli available for them to draw information from. But this can be just as much of a problem as it is a blessing, as these associations may lead to a tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in areas where none exist, a phenomenon that shares similarities with psychosis, which is where the positive correlation between openness to experience and positive schizotypy is believed to originate from. De Young and colleagues in 2012 explored the subdimensions of openness and intellect. The overlap with psychosis is found only on the far end of the openness dimension, so the experiencing aspect, and is not associated with the intellect dimension at all, suggesting it has something to do with the greater depth of perception or sensitivity people on the openness dimension have towards the world. Rand Blaine in 2020 further developed this idea by proposing another metric that places the openness subdimension of openness to experience on a continuum alongside psychosis. His newly developed framework found when there's a connection between experiencing and psychosis, there's more of a synchronization in the default mode network, but less in the cognitive control network, which hints at the fact people on the far end of the experiencing sensitivity scale might have a higher chance of experiencing psychosis. In this video, I hope I made it clear that open people's experiences represent a spectrum of cognitive, perceptual, and behavioral traits, and can mix and match in different ways that all still manifest in the end result of one being creative. Take the most common example of the creative archetype, the artist. Vincent van Gogh is who comes to mind for me. Kaufman et al. Found that high-achieving people in the arts domain tend to score higher on the openness dimension of openness to experience rather than the intellect dimension. Of course, this is not an end-all be-all, and I'm sure there are many artists that would score high on the intellect dimension as well. But what characterizes most artists is the fact that they have this breadth of perception towards the world that most people simply do not have. Along the same lines, Kaufman and colleagues also found that high-achieving people in the sciences domain tended to be higher on the intellect aspect of openness to experience rather than the openness dimension. Once again, some scientists may be more aesthetically gifted than others, but the point is that the most notable characteristic is their engagement with ideas, thus being described by their high scores on the intellect dimension of openness to experience. If we were to return back to the premise of this video, the primary takeaway is that creativity manifests itself in many different ways. But what all creative people have in common is an open-mindedness. This can be open in regards to perception and sensitivity in the case of artists, or open to ideas and thoughts in the case of philosophers or scientists. While creativity, or openness to experience, is a trait that is innate, so it's something you either possess or you don't, that doesn't mean it can't be enhanced at the margins. Kind of like how an introverted person can learn to be slightly more extroverted even though it's not in their nature. Through my experience, there has been a thought pattern I've used to come up with better ideas, and this is just my own anecdotal experience, but I call it the 3x3 model. Essentially, it works like this. On the y-axis, we have depth, which is basically how deep you want to go into a topic. So for example, you can center your ideation process around biology or go deeper and choose something like genetics or evolutionary biology. But the point is that it's not restricted, so you can choose something very specific like a trait such as bipedalism or AI or a specific video game. It doesn't really matter. On the x-axis, we have the number of domains. Now, I stick to 3 choices because 2 is generally too few and has probably been done before, while 4 is too many and can easily cause one to blur the lines between the different things we're trying to mix together. So 3 gives you the perfect amount of permutations. And then what I do is I basically add them together. This can be done by analyzing how 1 or 2 of the 3 domains affect the third one. So as an example, this channel is centered around evolutionary biology. I'm interested in fiction or storytelling, and I'm curious about how this could have evolved. So I came up with the idea of analyzing storytelling from an evolutionary perspective to see how it affects reproductive success. Or as another example, I'm interested in video games, my channel focuses on human evolution biology, and I'm curious about bipedalism. So I used video games to try and explain how bipedalism could have evolved. This is just a guideline I've used to come up with some of my ideas, but I hope it helps you in the same way it helps me. Until next time, cheers.